Good evening, everybody, and it is such a joy to welcome you to this, the inaugural session of our Pan-African Forums. I just have to say, it's such a thrill. I think we've been talking about this for a while, dreaming about it, planning it, and it truly is such a joy to say welcome to everybody, each one of you who has chosen to join us today. My name is Mishai Mwangola. I will be your moderator, your host, the person who you will speak through as you send in your questions and answers. And it is, again, a privilege to serve you in this way. The chat is open. If you have any questions, any comments, we will be taking those, and I'll be using those just to interweave through the conversation. Please feel free to comment as we go along. Feel free to just say hi to everybody. Tell us where you're from. And if you want to mention why you're here, we'd be really, really happy to pick that up. This is the Pan-African Forums, and kindly brought to you by three partners: The Elephant, whom you can find on www.theelephant.info, Alliance Française de Nairobi, and IFRA Nairobi, all of whom work in the space of facilitating, enabling, amplifying, supporting intellectual way in one way or the other. So what is the Pan-African Forums, and what do you expect when you join us? Let me give you a little bit, just a snapshot of how we got here. I think it was somewhere in the middle of the year when, in conversations we were having amongst ourselves and asking if there was something we could do together, we observed that a world that is generally shaped by neoliberalism, a world where usually Africa is standing, and certainly Kenya, where we were speaking from, seems to be on the margins, was changing very rapidly. That in this world, the COVID-19 pandemic, which by that time had made very clear that it was going to be a global pandemic and not a localized crisis for one country or a few countries, we realized it had done something interesting. It seemed to have pressed the pause button, so to speak, forcing every single country in the world to interrogate its own priorities. So suddenly we were thinking about global leadership in terms of health rather than wealth. Some of the countries that had, and regions of the world that had become models to emulate, to aspire to become, suddenly became objects of pity, sometimes of bemused fascination, as we saw them fumble, stumble, and in some cases fall flat. On the other hand, countries and regions, including our own country and our own region in Africa, made what had seemed the most dire predictions that everything would go completely wrong, seem like rather pessimistic dreams that fell flat. And this confounded everyone, including ourselves. So we thought, could we be witnessing a turning place in history? Would the pandemic, despite all the negative it had brought, also spur the creation of new mechanisms for a new model of society? Could it offer us a new space to dream and envision a new world from the standpoint of where we were? Could COVID-19 become a force for fostering social progress? So to answer that question, we brought together 4 virtual panels under the banner of what we called the Corona Cafes. The first 3 were very much centered on Kenya, where all 3 of the host partners were based. But then we expanded the scope of the 4th discussion to the rest of the continent, as it became increasingly clear to us that this was not just a Kenyan conversation, and that many of the things we were observing and talking about in the Corona Cafes were also being witnessed in the countries around us. And many of the examples and models we were finding useful for us were actually being drawn from within our own region. So by the time we wound up that series, we knew 2 clear things. One, we needed to continue to offer this space of engagement. And what I think we really, really got to enjoy was being able to listen to intellectuals working in very different spaces, conversing and catalyzing our own thinking on a set theme. In this case, it was the whole Corona pandemic and what it was doing to our countries. But it was great to listen to all of these different intellectuals engaging each other, and for ourselves as witnesses to be able to participate in catalyzing their thinking. I think one of my favorite things was that every single person who came on a panel was very, talked to us about how much it had enriched their own thinking and their own work. And then the second thing that became clear was that we needed to make this a bigger conversation in terms of the scope of what we were covering, but also a bigger conversation in terms of moving beyond the boundaries of Kenya, of even East Africa, to include what we are roughly calling the African world. And that's why we came to the theme of the Pan-African Forums. And very simply, what we are seeking to do in this series of conversations is to explore the meaning of the identity African in relation to the range of challenges facing those who identify with the continent of Africa and its diaspora. So over a period of 9 or 10 months, we'll be hosting a monthly conversation. We are currently expecting to schedule this on the first Tuesday of every month. And in it, we'll explore a whole range of ideas, realities, challenges, experiences, possibilities, visions, contradictions that come with using Africa as a basis for collectively imagining and organizing towards the future. So yes, we'll start in the past we have come from. We'll very much speak from the standpoint of the present, but we want to move towards the future. In today's inaugural conversation, we want to get a sense of what does it mean when we talk about our theme, Africa beyond the nation state. And then next week, what we'll do is we'll pick up on the conversation that Brian begins today, and we will bring in a couple of other intellectuals whose work we really admire, and we will broaden the conversation that we start. So today I hope that we will explore the concept. What do we mean when we say Pan-Africanism? Are we talking of pan with a hyphen? Is it one word? Does it include everybody? Does it leave out more people than it brings in? What are the perspectives, the opinions? Where did this concept even come from? And so we'll do a little bit of looking at the history of the evolution of this time and grasp some of the nuances of of the different definitions and the ways that people have talked and worked using it. And then we'll bring it to the present. So what does this all mean? And so I cannot tell you how excited I am to have the guest that we have chosen to set us off on this conversation. Before I introduce him, let me just give you a little bit of the logistics. Please, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A. Maybe after 20 or so minutes, I'm going to take a time and come back and just do a round of questions, mostly questions that are looking for clarification or something that you feel that you would want Brian to expound a little bit on. And then we'll go and then take another round of questions after another 15 or 20 minutes. So we should have some really great time to engage Brian. So please feel free to put your questions and answers for those of you in the webinar in the Q&A. For those of you who are on YouTube, and I really, really want to welcome you as well, if you are joining us by live stream, please put any questions, comments, answers in the comments below, and somebody will be monitoring that and bringing those questions and answers to us. Otherwise, feel free to use the chat. And without further much ado, let me introduce our guest, Brian Kagoro, Pan-Africanist. Brian is a lawyer. He tells me that he is particularly invested in the question of development governance. I know that Brian, and I'm not sure how he would identify himself, given that we're talking about Africa beyond the nation states. But Brian, I do know that you travel on a Zimbabwean passport. I know you were born in Zimbabwe. I believe you're now talking to us from South Africa. And I know yesterday when we were talking about preparing for this particular session, you told me that you had just arrived from Ethiopia. So you're clearly somebody who lives and breathes this idea of being a Pan-Africanist. So Karibu, Brian, and have I mischaracterized you in any of those ways?
I think you have described me aptly, and thank you for having me on this particular dialogue.
If you could just take us through the evolution of Pan-Africanism. But I love the books behind you. It makes me feel like, so everybody, let me tell you something. Yesterday, after we had our first conversation, Brian sent us an entire list of recommended readings, which we'll be sharing with you later on. Brian, I am just a little bit intrigued after doing all the readings that you sent me and then thinking through how I understand Pan-Africanism. Is it possible for you to give me what your working definition is? I know we're going to go through a number of concepts and understandings, but just to set us off, when you tell me I am a Pan-Africanist, which is the first thing you told me in terms of who you are, what exactly do you mean?
So that means I believe in a movement, a global movement that encourages solidarity of Africans worldwide, that is African citizens, African migrants, and Afro-descendants, those who are in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, in North America as a result of the slave trade. And the belief is that our destiny as those on the continent and the destiny of those in the diaspora, Afro-descendants, are intertwined, and that our unity in struggle and in many dimensions of life would be key, vital to our economic, social, and political progress as a collective. And therefore that the sake of unity is not just a feel good, but it's for our mutual upliftment. And if the fate of Africans globally is intertwined, it follows that the fate of African countries, notwithstanding who colonized them, are intertwined. So I believe in the integration, not just of states, but in the integration of African people socially and economically. Because in my sense, none of our economies, because of how they were hurriedly divided in Berlin, is economically viable on its own. And that belief, therefore, as you have seen, evolved from ideas that were propounded by many people. And I'll talk about some of the people, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Sylvestre, Kwame Nkrumah, and others in the historical and in the modern. And I'll also describe how the Pan-Africanism evolved from the 1909 Pan-African Conference until we reached the 1994 Pan-African Congress, the 7th Pan-African Congress, and what factors in between influenced that evolution and gave it shape, gave it substance. Just maybe to underscore the basis of the arguments that I will give is that we don't make history in circumstances of our own choosing, right? The circumstances that we navigate and those historic figures of Pan-Africanism will found themselves in particular social cultural circumstances. The second point I wish to make right from the onset is diaspora Pan-Africanism was born out of crisis. The crisis engendered by slavery, the slave trade, and the treatment of Afro-descendants within slave plantations and the so-called developed world as property, as chattel that could be sold, disposed of, abused, and used by those that owned them. And so in that sense, the birth out of crisis inescapably was linked to three ideas. The number one is the question of race as predeterminant of one's humanity. So the contest against racism, and in particular anti-Black racism, or white racism in particular. The second was humanity. So beyond the race aperture, what it meant to be human, other than having breath in your nostrils, what it would take to be human. So the struggles for equal humanity that were transacted through civil rights movement, that were transacted through other forms of struggle. And then the third was economic citizenship, the idea that it was not enough not to be racially discriminated against. It was not enough not to be called words or names that were derogatory, that for you to live an equal life, equal to your fellow human beings, you needed the economic means, the wherewithal to live a full life. So in its evolution within the diaspora, it was about this aspiration, these three aspirations, and there was a fourth, which is a yearning for a return to Africa. And that's why those who discuss the Gaviat movements about returning to Africa, about former slaves that were liberated returning to Africa. And of course, the flip side is that there were those former slaves who wanted to be integrated within the economies and the nation states where they found themselves in, and wanted greater autonomy, greater recognition of their rights and protection by the law. So the rule of law, access to justice, and human rights component of the Pan-African struggle finds itself within the continent. When you come to 1945, and And as I have said before, Pan-Africanist struggles or struggles that had a Pan-Africanist bent did not start in 1945. I use 1945, the Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester, because what it helps define is it was the first Congress that specifically discussed the question of African liberation. And in that discussion of liberation, as you will see between the Fifth Congress and the Sixth, 4 other strands were added over and above what already existed. Number 1 strand was the question of decolonization and decoloniality. And linked to this, of course, was the anti-imperial strand. And this essentially meant that those who were fighting for a Pan-Africanist vision were fighting to decolonize, as well as fighting to unshackle Africa from the yoke of imperialism. Herein lies the third one, which is nationalism emerges as a galvanizing and organizing doctrine and approach. And so I want from the onset to say that nationalism was born out of Pan-Africanism and not vice versa. And nationalisms had 2 dimensions that were related to the historical struggles, diaspora struggles that I have referred to. In most residual colonial settler states and colonial states, including Kenya, where you sit, South Africa, where I am, is the white settler regimes had established race or the color line as the basis of exclusion, an ideology of supremacy that was centered on color. But what had also happened is that in their divide and rule approach, they had established ethnicity as a distinguishing factor amongst the different African national groups that they had conscripted. So you ended up with 2 strands that will become important as we discuss the present and the future, where liberation was limited first to liberation within borders that had been defined by colonial powers. And even within those borders, liberation movement appropriated an identity of nation that was yet to be fully formed, because people had not historically identified themselves within the confines of those colonial borders as nations. There were different national groups that cut across nations. And then the last bit is race. So the conversation about racism. And we will come to the third, perhaps towards the end of our discussion, that begins to look at the agency of women within the Pan-Africanist struggles, both the historical that I have listed as the Congress in 1909, all the way up to the 7th Pan-Africanist Congress, the central role played by women, but also the marginalization that happened even within the movement, and how at the 7th Pan-African Congress, women asserted or reasserted their role, reasserted their status and position. So gender becomes an important key element. So with those, I think what I have essentially said is, it is a way of life, it is an ideological outlook to the world that has components about liberating the continent from external control, whether it's social, economic, political, or psychological. And the final thing, of course, in its evolution, was there was a realization amongst African activists and scholars, and this is captured splendidly by 2 Pan-Africanists. One is Bantu Steve Biko in his book, I Write What I Like, and the other is by Frantz Fanon. And of course, in the Americas, it is by Carter G. Woodson, who wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And he suggested, Carter G. Woodson, that you don't have to control a man. You don't have to tell him which door to use. If you control the person's mind, they will do what is predetermined. And then Steve Biko expanded on it and said, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And Fanon suggested that what the Imperial Project did, and it's echoed in Ngugi, it's echoed in Chinua Achebe, was to take the African elite, the most brilliant amongst us, take them to the Imperial Center, empty them of any sense of African value or pride, instill in them a sense of exceptionalism, by their similarity and yet not equality to the imperial center. Return them, having filled them with colonial knowledge, and their own people realized that their sons and daughters had not returned. What had returned were mere echoes of the empire, and what I refer to elsewhere as model missionaries of Black inferiority or white supremacy. So they can be Black, they can talk Africa, but they have a quintessential belief that Africans are unable to. So Pan-Africanism is a state of mind and an approach to life that says Africa can, Africa has, and Africa will.
Wow, okay. That's okay. You've given me a really good space to begin to think. Now, I guess my question then would be, how did we get from, and you talked about, I know you mentioned the 7th Pan-African Congress, so I assume there were 6 others before that. How did we get from that space, the broad space where you have the diaspora beginning to organize, to think, and I know you've talked about it. Could you take us then how the term continued to, a little bit more into the strands and the different ways of how it has evolved? I know I want to come to the present, but there are just some things that are in my mind. For example, it seems to me you're saying Pan-Africanism is very externally driven. It is about what others think and impose on us, and therefore we are reacting and responding, as opposed to it being self-driven. And maybe I've gotten that completely wrong. So I'd love to hear how you can.
No, so I already indicated that there were other struggles that were linked to African consciousness. The struggles that led to the resistance of white settler occupation of our countries were in essence Pan-Africanist. Remember, there were no countries so-called. These people were able to mobilize across ethnic divide against the new enemies. And what did they use? They used the common destiny mantra. There were struggles within the faith sector, something called Abyssinianism, which was about those who had converted to Christianity. And I need to clarify this, that Islam and Christianity have episodal arrivals on the continent. The first set of Christians on the continent in the Sudan and Ethiopia were not as a result of colonialism. So those countries had assumed the Christian faith, if you like, by voluntary conscription. It was not forcible conversion. It was not part of the colonial enterprise, which is totally different when you come to West Africa and portions of East Africa and Southern Africa. And within those entities, what grew to be independent African churches were struggles by people who were saying the idea of a God who's a particular race is antithetical to the notion of divinity. And that therefore, if they were to worship, they needed to worship a deity in ways that they could relate to. So there was a struggle within the faith sectors, within Islam, within Christianity, and even within traditional belief systems. And remember, Africa had for over 5 centuries influenced Asian and influence other civilizations through trade in terms of how they saw faith and trade, as well as, if you like, science and technology. And this is well captured in a book by Chancellor Williams that's titled The Destruction of a Black Civilization. But where I wanted to take us to is the first group of people who organized Pan-African conferences were concerned about plight as it related to where they were geographically. And they felt that liberation was represented by 2 things. By this intellectual free zones that allowed Black folk to think based on their traditions and their cultures. By an economic free zone, which is what Gavi tried, that allowed Black people, Black entrepreneurs to create value, employ their own people, buy from their own businesses. But there was a third, the idea of a political space that required them to find a country and hence the return to Africa. But within the African continent, before the 1945 Congress, you will know that the ANC had already been founded in South Africa. And there were political formations that were espousing a Pan-Africanist, so Robert Sobukwe and others. There are many others across the continent that were espousing a Pan-Africanist agenda, right? That were espousing this idea of unity that went beyond primordial identities. the unity that required us to unshackle ourselves from external control, or the so-called invader class. So in essence, Pan-Africanism, like any global ideology, Pan-Africanism, like any social, cultural, and political way of seeing and doing things, or economic system, is not insular. It's not protected 100% from influences from other traditions, ways of seeing and doing that it interfaces with. Much of what we call Greek mythology, Greek science, they essentially borrowed from Africa, but they don't call it externally driven. They own it. A lot of what we refer to as the arts. So for example, as you know, what we call vaccines is a practice that a slave owner was taught by a slave from Africa about how you deal with smallpox and other pathogens. So, but they don't call vaccines an essentially African invention. It is this idea of understanding Pan-Africanism and its evolution when Africans interacted with each other beyond the nation-state boundaries. Africans interacted with other oppressed peoples in Latin America and Asia and the Caribbean, the shaping of a common destiny narrative, the shaping of an internationalism. And then, of course, as I have already said, there was a shaping of a nationalism, which is why Nkrumah, Nyerere, in trying to warn us, says, nationalism, if it is not quintessentially Pan-Africanist, is moribund. And what he was describing is that the narrow identity does not bring freedom in and of itself. Unity does not bring freedom unless if you add all the other things that now define Pan-Africanism. So quickly, the Fifth Congress discussed liberation, and out of it came the support to liberation movements. Jomo Kenyatta went back to Kenya, so did Nkrumah and Banda, and essentially the processes for decolonization and liberation started then. The Sixth Pan-Africanist Congress was the first to be held on the continent. It was held in Dar es Salaam. It was organized by volunteers, hosted by President Nyerere. And part of what it dealt with were very interesting fundamental things. And I wish to just walk you through what some of the Sixth Pack. So the Sixth Pack had contradictions around race and class. Africans felt that the disproportionate focus amongst African Americans on race underscored or underestimated the power of class as an instrument in Black liberation. And also there were, if you like, contest over the fact that opposition groups from the Caribbean and liberated African countries were allowed to participate. As a result, C.L.R. James, who was the co-chair, actually quit midstream the Congress. But what was its agenda? It was how to end economic exploitation and dependency. So the self-reliance agenda came into that conversation. It was how to complete political independence of those countries that were still under the yoke of colonialism. Number three, it was how to gain international support for the struggle for decolonization and to end apartheid. And so part of its achievements was that it was the most assertive statement on ending neo-colonialism and imperialism. And also a very strong statement on revolutionary social transformation of African societies and communities, as well as a focus which had not been in the Pan-Africanist movement on Africa as a solution, not to African problems, but to global problems. And of course, there was a challenge, as I said, with the participation of women, but there were several women that were involved in there. There's quite a lot of write-up by Cortland Cox, James Garrett, and Charlie Cobbs as people from the Black Power movement who were involved, as well as South Africans. A South African poet called Hrapetse Hositsile was one of the chief organizers of the Sixth Congress. So there were African thespians, there are African artists. So it wasn't just politicians. So until we get to Kampala in 1994, the Congress was organized by clergy, by academics, by activists, community organizers, and by artists. And this is the nature of Pan-Africanism, its value on all dimensions of Africanness, or Africanity as liberatory, whether it's culture, whether it's intellectual endeavor, economic endeavor, and so on and so forth. The seventh pack presented two problems. African states took a great interest in the seventh pack. The interest they took, Horace Campbell critiques it as what moved the seventh pack to a fundamental disconnect between what was happening in the Congress and the popular people's struggles on the streets, in the villages, and elsewhere, because it officialed on the idea that progressive African states and leaders, new leaders, would constitute a vanguard that would drive the agenda of Pan-Africanism. And remember, this is when South Africa is going through its post-apartheid moment and Rwanda was in the throes of a genocide. So the focus on the state had its justifications, but the critiques of this preponderant role played by the state, either as enabler or facilitator, suggest that this marked the dominance of state-centric Pan-Africanism and how Pan-Africanism from below that I have described that characterize all the packs up to the sixth pack was beginning to wane. And the crisis we are in is when most people critique Pan-Africanism, it's in essence a reference to the failures of African political elites as opposed to the popular movement of Africans, of Black people, Afro-descendants, organizing for their self-liberation and economic self-determination.
Just for the record, so we have the first to the fifth all being held out in the diaspora, with the final one, I think that's the Manchester one that we hear, at least on the continent, we hear a lot about. And then we have Kampala, and I believe the last one was Arusha. Am I right about that?
No, actually, the eighth pack didn't happen. We tried to, when the AU was celebrating its 50th anniversary, to get this to happen in Accra, Ghana. When we arrived in Accra, Ghana, we realized as members of the International Preparatory Committee that there were challenges in how it had been constituted. Of course, some people seeing opportunities had burst in, people who had actually no idea, no historical background on what this was. But different individuals purported to hold 8th Pan-Africanist Congresses of their own. One held in Johannesburg, so if you Google, one held. And this fragmentation is an ideological fragmentation. And as I have said, you will see as we trace the relationship to nationalism, that most people think it's purely a failure of leadership. And those of us who've observed as students of African history say it was also a failure of structure, partly because Pan-Africanism from the 5th up to the 7th Congress emerges during the context of the Cold War, where, as we now know from declassified CIA files, Mossad, MI5, and other external agencies, that the assassination of people like Patrice Lumumba, the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah, barely 2 years and 8 months after the 1963 OAU Congress, and further poisoning, assassination, and instability that we saw in Mozambique and Angola, facilitated and sponsored by the apartheid regime in South Africa by the West, speaks to context that we must understand. The West, in the interest of its Cold War politics, as well as the East, were unwilling to let Africa or Africans determine their own course. So when we sit or stand and say, Nyerere failed or so and so failed, and we dehistoricize the context of that failure. And this is not to excuse some of the kleptomania that we have seen, some of the brutality, tyranny, and impunity, but it is simply to locate it within a context. Those brutes, those kleptomaniacs, were mostly clients and they were mostly agents, not of African voters, but imposed by external forces, former colonial powers, and imperial forces. So you cannot discuss Pan-Africanism, its success or failure, without discussing geopolitics, global geopolitics and geoeconomics, the interest of the rest of the world in Africa.
Brian, wow. Okay, my mind is trying to just go through all the things you've said. I want us to bring us to the present, but before we do that, you mentioned that they were ideological, differences. And I think this is where a lot of people just feel that they get bogged down in these concepts of what does Pan-Africanism mean. And I'm wondering if you could perhaps just briefly walk us through the different strands, right? So there's the Pan-Africanism that people associate with, say, negritude or the cultural side, you know, how we dress, what we listen to, that kind of thing. Then we have those who will look at it, you know, the political part of it, very much associated with people like Nkrumah, I would believe. And then you have the one, and you'd referred earlier to this, the idea of how important it is to look at how all these struggles are very much about also the economy, about how we live, about those real practical things. And I don't know how you would characterize them, but perhaps if you could just talk us through some of those strands, and maybe also mention, when I'm reading and I'm looking at all the conversations, which names might be associated with different ways of thinking, so that I have a sense of how to locate these discussions.
Yeah, so the shift into what was called state-centric Pan-Africanism started early. And most people, when they read, it's simply referred to as the Casablanca group and the Monrovia group. The Casablanca group being Ghana and Egypt led, and of course Guinea, Sekou Touré, and the Monrovia group being Ethiopia and all the other independent African countries that were leaning more towards America, towards the West. The difference between Casablanca and Monrovia was not necessarily just a difference about the pace of integration. It was an ideological difference. The Casablanca group, and let me put this in context. When we were doing Pan-Africanism before, when there was no independent African state other than Ethiopia, and depending on how you look at Liberia and Sierra Leone, what people were discussing were, if you like, 5 layers. The notion of territory as definitive of liberty, the notion of rights as definitive of humanity. So whether those rights are conceptualized as racial justice, inclusion, and so on and so forth. So the Casablanca Monrovia group is in essence, so if you are reading Haile Selassie and you're reading Nkrumah, it's an ideological difference about their perspective of the role of the state, which is interesting because Selassie was an emperor, right? And Nkrumah believed that you needed socialism as a liberating agenda that would bring. And then when you read Nyerere, Nyerere believed in socialism, but not in African socialism. So when you read Nyerere, you'll see that his strand was towards African socialism. And Nkrumah was critical of the idea of African socialism and insisting that we should only focus on scientific socialism. But because these were highly nuanced debates they were having, their difference was reduced into Nyerere saying the best way to integrate, given our divisions, was to do it gradually. Start with the regional economic communities and then build up into Nkrumah's idea of a United States of Africa. Nkrumah wanted a United States of Africa immediately. Now, that would have been a scary prospect, given that Nkrumah ascribed to socialism. For the United States of America, within the context of the Cold War, to have 54 countries under the leadership of a proponent of socialism would have been a geopolitical coup d'etat. And that is why the amounts of money poured into defeating the Union government now idea. Of course, the rationalization sounded attractive, that all people are so divided. No one paid the attention to the fact that the thing called the United States of Africa is made up of fundamentally many irreconcilable ethnicities, but they were able to somehow magically call themselves the United States of America with 50 states. And here we were 54, and everybody would refer to our ethnicity as a barrier to unity. The other thing that you're going to see as you read through this, you read how Europe underdeveloped Africa, written by Brother Rodney. They spent a lot of time with Nkrumah. So you read Horace Campbell, Rasta and Resistance, looking at linking the struggle of the Morans in Jamaica with the broader struggles, basically liberatory struggles against colonial occupation. So the left finally won, because at the 40th anniversary of Ghana's independence, Nkrumah was late, as you know. Nkrumah died, having been overthrown. Sekou Touré of Guinea made him a core president. So Nkrumah dies in exile, and Amilcar Cabral wrote a note that those who are interested in reading called the Cancer of Betrayal, just referring to how our own people betrayed Nkrumah. But Nyere remained an important apology posthumously to Nkrumah, because they differed on this issue of when to integrate. And his notion was that Nkrumah was right, that if we move at a slow pace, the rest of the world would not give us the opportunity to finally integrate, because they will keep us divided. And he was referring to this colonial heritage of a state system that is forged during European colonial rule within fixed borders, political and legal systems that were outward looking, that essentially constructed all of us into little Europeans, both in appearance, in what we wear in our courts of law, and in the laws that we applied, and the infrastructure that was designed to serve the extraction of our most valuable natural resources. And the second, enclave economies that were designed such that Africans around mining centers and coal could not benefit. They would not become co-owners or beneficiaries in any meaningful way. So this divided, fragmented Africa, politically divided, economically wasteful, would remain non-viable. So the idea of sovereignty, whether of the small nation state or of Africa in such a fragmented context, would not make sense. Herein lies the challenge when you look at these strands. As we are doing liberation, and as countries are experiencing liberation, they also experience neocolonialism, rulership by Black elite. And in this, they experience tyranny, they experience the rise of ethnocracies, people who govern with their tribes, they experience divisive politics. So in essence, the fiction of the nation, which was supposed to be an all-inclusive entity, becomes demystified when the greed of the elite that took over power at independence begins to play out. And their most primordial instinct, which is aligning with interests that are other than the broader ideological and class interests with whom they had fought for liberation. The biggest losers in this were women, because the same men that had fought alongside women claimed equality in the struggle. Soon after independence, they went into some frightening cultural relativism that moved from women who could be equals in bearing arms were suddenly being told in the application of Western law that they were perpetual minors. Women required the authority of their husbands to do an infinite number of things. This robbery of the agency of women and this excuse of using distorted or manipulated constructions of culture became the birthplace of a reassertion of a feminist Pan-Africanist lens that says liberation is a total enterprise. Pan-Africanism is an all-embracing enterprise. It has no exceptions in its nature. Certainly is not sexist, and certainly is not tribalist or functionalist in religious terms. The second loser were young people. And it's important when we discuss the COVID moment, because the young people found themselves in this invidious position where there were qualifications set during the imperial days or the colonial days, qualifications of when you could become a local councillor, local government representative, a governor, when you could become a prime minister or a president, that were ageist. And yet, in order to bear arms, to liberate your country, nobody asked for your birth certificate. They asked for your consciousness and your commitment. So, and all African struggles were always led by young people. Some young people were slightly older after 10, 15, 20 years of liberation. Countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Namibia, you will see that their first cabinets, and Kenya too, if you look at Mboya and others, were all under the age of 35. 40. And this ageist gerontocratic Africa, which is now associated with Pan-Africanism or godfatherhood of Pan-Africanism, is as alien to Pan-Africanism as the ideology of eldership or governance by eldership. Because the idea of Pan-Africanism, you will see from the first to the 7th Pan-Africanist Congress, it was calling on women and calling on young people to use their energy, their intellectual rigor to drive the next phase of liberation and to lead it. So the privatization of states that we have seen, the substitution of the people by political parties that are not representative, this idea of a mortgaged political elite that is more accountable to external powers and forces is, if you like, opposed to Pan-Africanism. Every Pan-Africanism must see it as their revolutionary duty to fight, to oppose, to resist any entity or person that uses age, non-progressive constructions of culture, and the divine right to rule as a basis for looting the state and as a basis for excluding others. And this is the essence of Pan-Africanism. A revolution was not an event, it is not an event. A revolution is a constant process. Each generation, Frantz Fanon said, must discover its mission, fulfill it in relative opacity or betray it. This generation's mission is to destroy pretentious Pan-Africanism that uses pan and lacks both the pan and the Africanism.
Okay, so you brought me and to this present moment. Before we do that, Wandi Enjoya has a question. What upset CLR James in Tanzania? If you could just give us a little bit of an inkling of that, and then we can move on to, I really do want us to now focus on the now.
So basically, because of the ideological differences, they were opposition groups that were being brought from the Caribbean that CLR James believed were clients of imperial or US interests. And the spirit under which they had been brought was that African liberation was not a closed book. Pan-Africanism was not an endorsement of indigenized oppression. And this is repeated by Samora Machel and others, that in essence, if within a liberated state, and Nyerere said this repeatedly, people did not feel that they were liberated and free. Those who were fighting for freedom in liberated countries belonged and deserved an audience within the Pan-Africanist space. CLR James' idea was that we were allowing infiltrators and spies. And remember, this is during the Cold War, to participate in the most premier Pan-Africanist circuit or circle. And this is what led him to quit. The Congress continued even after he had quit.
Thank you. Nganga Wahu Mushiri wonders, I'm eager to hear Brian delve a little more into the idea of Africa. Which Africa exactly are we building upon? V. Mudimbe talks about the invention of Africa. We know of the way the West imagines a poor, dirty, hungry continent. We also know the way in which political elites marshal a vision of pre-European Africa that is skewed against women. How do we wade through those weeds to locate an Africa that is empowering as opposed to any other kind?
I think, thank you so much for that wonderful question. All civilization, and we must never allow any person, because we're students of history, all civilization was hierarchized, hierarchical, oppressive, repressive. It is just how each civilization talks about its history. So the barbarians in Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte, they talk about him as a hero, but in essence, he was not. And it seems to me that the first business, and this is why Mishera Mugo and other sisters who've brought thinking about creating this liberated zones of thought have brought to Pan-Africanism, is that first we must redeem our history from the distortions of the lens of empire. That of native running around aimlessly naked with no purpose, no history, no science, no invention. And this is a matter that has been contested because it therefore suggested that we were saved from ourselves by European invaders and slavers. So to redeem that history, that means we need to study what we are, who we were. UNESCO has done a volume, I think it's 8 to 16 volume, that looks at pre-colonial Africa. It's a fascinating set of studies that I would recommend to people on here to read, because that, together with Chancellor Williams, The Destruction of a Black Civilization. The idea of invented Africa, I think I've just talked already about how many of our countries were invented. There was no Kenya, there was no. So when you say Najivunia kwa Kenya, I'm proud to be, you're saying I'm proud to be the stepchild of an imperial conspiracy in Berlin. As I said, we make history not from circumstances of our choosing, but we make history from where we are. That identity, there are two ways you can stand and say there's no Luo, there's no Gikuyu, there's no identity. It's a construct. If you go to Zimbabwe, for example, there's no tribe called Shona. They just took a group of people who came from a place. The Gujarat word for gold is Sona, S-O-N-A. And when the Indians used to trade with my ancestors, they used to go to the Great Zimbabwe and say they're going to buy gold. So they called that place the land of the Sona, the land of gold. And the later European invaders constructed a whole group of different national groups as Shona. There's no tribe called Ndebele because it refers to 5 or so different ethnic groups: the Venda, the Sutu, the Xhosa, Samguni, elements, the Kalanga, who speak a totally different world and culture. But those constructed identities have led to violence in our countries. So in Kenya, whilst Mount Kenya may not have been the original place where people settled, they came from, the idea of a Mount Kenya mafia, the idea of the lake being the home of particular people, has legends that have been associated with it. If you want to deconstruct peculiarities and particularities that construct what Amin Malouf called identities that kill, you need to, there is no cure to destructive localism other than Pan-Africanism. So that's why China calls 55 African countries to deal with it. It's not worried whether you're Kenya or, that's why India. So it's a Sino-Africa, India, Africa, Turkey, Africa. So we can condemn our leaders for being called by one country. But when the rest of the world sees opportunity, it sees that. The one thing, though, that frustrates me as a Pan-Africanist is that Africans themselves, including African governments, never market Africa as a place of history. They never market Africa as a place of ideas and innovation. They market Africa as come and see the big 5. Come and visit the beautiful beach in Mombasa or Zanzibar. They come, we've got manganese, coltrane, gold. We have allowed extractivism to define continental identity and even national identity, that people reduce the value that Africa has to not to human beings, not to our intellect, not to our contribution to global civilization, but to things that naturally occur. And even such things are things that have been fenced off from our access, whether it's wildlife, it's flora or fauna. So yes, the beauty of Africa exoticized, the beauty of Africa alienated from ordinary Africans. But that is not the end of the matter. It's African economies alienated. And because the logic of African political elites is to run their countries in order to serve these external economic and other interests, that means our governance is alienated from our own people. So our people can stay without service as long as the tourists have world-class service. The tragedy of our movement is not that we don't talk Pan-Africanism. It's not that we are unable to redeem an identity of being African that is unshackled from the fetishes and fantasies of the West or the romanticism of the African political elite. It is simply that we ourselves have accepted this debilitating localism, such that a young man in South Africa or a young woman in South Africa forgets this, that apartheid's greatest achievement was not only to divide South Africa into Bantustans, but to keep a person so localized that any visitor other than a white person or a foreigner was seen as a threat or an enemy. And that same person has no ambition to go and work in Kenya, in Cote d'Ivoire, or elsewhere where the skill they've acquired through university or technicum would be better served. Why? Because they've been told there's danger beyond your borders. Nothing is as good as the oppression and the misery that you find. This lack of a global perspective amongst our people, reinforced by those who freely take rucksacks and travel across Africa as though there were no governments, trade in human beings in narcotics and in valuable wildlife pieces. It is a problem that our own governments treat African citizens as criminals, but a bigger problem that as Africans, not only has the invented Africa dominated how we think, what's worse is that it is the divided and fragmented Africa that has become our embraced reality. That's why your passport, based on a geographic territory defined by some white men drinking whiskey in Berlin, cannot become your destiny. If it does, then not only are you accepting imperialism and colonialism, you are accepting that as the globe moves into the fourth industrial revolution, your immobility is your fate. You will forever be a consumer, and you will forever be a footnote of the history of human development.
Okay, the questions are beginning to come in fast and furious, and you've taken us to this present moment. Yeah, so what? Yes, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, we talked about this, we've been working on it, but what does this mean for the present moment? Earlier on, I was in a webinar and we were discussing what does the EndSARS movement mean for those of us who are not in Nigeria. And I think I began by talking about COVID-19 and how for us it became a place not so much just to really go into the intricacies of what was happening in our different countries in the COVID moment, but to ask how do we think beyond that? When we look at the anti-Black movement that's spreading across the world, and then we, for a while it seemed to be out there in the diaspora. And EndSARS has not only gotten us worrying and reflecting emotionally, financially, intellectually in what's happening in Nigeria, but also turning it back into our own countries. So a couple of questions that get us really engaging with this in some detail. Irene Nyakagera Thomas asks, could you speak a little bit more about this generation's revolutionary mission against pretentious Pan-Africanism? And I want to bring that together with Mpiwa J.S. Mangiwiro, who is on YouTube, who asks, how can the Pan-African movement gain momentum and relevance in this era where nationhood that is limited to geographical boundaries is gaining so much momentum?
Let's define this. Thank you, Irene. Thank you, Mpiwa. Let's define what we're seeing, because it might help us answer quickly. We're seeing a global debt crisis. That's, we are told, with the liquidity crisis in Africa, that's going to lead to underdevelopment in Africa. So the limits of law, of trade, and power of the African nation state. But within it, we're seeing a labor crisis in the African formal sector because of the shutdown, and in the informal sector that people I don't need to emphasize. But we're also seeing new forms, as well as exacerbated forms of pre-existing socioeconomic challenges, underlying prejudices and exclusions. So we saw racism against Black students in China. We're seeing racism and xenophobia, and we're seeing the rise of sexual and gender-based violence, right? As part of this labor crisis and liquidity crisis. So the rights struggle that for a long time was not linked to a class struggle, right? And that did not link itself necessarily to global racism and international law. So you cannot talk about the rights of women, of youth, of informal traders without realizing that why they've suffered the most during the context of COVID is because of the class they belong to, right? Even when countries were doing recovery plans, although they paid lip service to dealing with the informal sector, there were heftier injections into the so-called formal sector, big capital. We're seeing, therefore, a crisis of global development and a crisis of globalization. And that crisis translates into a crisis of the state. Our states are militarized, global development is militarized, and it's financialized. And part of what happened when we shut down, we realized that Africa was dependent on imports for almost everything, including basic things. Africa had not invested in its own local economies and home industries. So nationalism that touted this idea of a private sector dependent or driven growth in the context of deeply fragmented societies and economies and politics. And this jobless growth that I think women and others have commented on, as well as the lumpenization of our young people and the feminization of poverty and the deepening inequality, has essentially meant that we don't only have a crisis of leadership that COVID has highlighted, but we have a crisis of institutions. African institutions were not prepared to work virtually. African institutions had already stopped providing any quality service to citizens. So we had a crisis of citizenship because civil society was organized around this narrow donor-driven interest. Intersectional cross-movement organizing was weak. And in this moment, also, we know we will have a crisis of environment or ecology. So doing change in an ideological or ethical vacuum, or trying to imagine inclusive futures in which we don't have a repeat of what we saw under COVID, is something that this generation must deal with. So, I mean, it's a generation that lives in choiceless and contentless democracies, right? Where voting is a ritual, where they feel betrayed by a political elite, where they feel excluded, where the entire political process becomes a recycling exercise for decadent, useless, incapable, old and young people. And then what you're seeing is globally the rise of the alt-right, populism and radicalization. So there is a sentiment that's anti-establishment, whether the establishment is NGOs, the establishment is private sector, the establishment is the state elite. And it's global, it's not just Africa, right? And this failure of institutions, the reason, and I liked your introduction, Mshai, the reason why Europe and America have been unable to contain and to deal with COVID is partly because they have propounded an economic development approach that does not value or place people at the center. An approach that values profit, and as such, the scandal and crisis they face is trying to reinvest in the public in the context of a global pandemic. So this failure of institutions, so what was their instinctive response? Militarization. Deploy the army to deal with poverty and inequality. And obviously what we've seen are the sort of clashes. So you have these hollowed out states, especially in Africa. They are weak in their capacity to do meaningful development or invest in public goods, right? And the function of the state, the soulless state, and the function of CSOs and intellectuals who have become echoes of the empire, essentially means when you're looking at development aid, defense, or foreign policies of America, of Europe, even in the context of the pandemic, they are actuated by what Nyerere and Nkrumah were fighting. This notion of saving the native, as opposed to developing infrastructure, developing institutions, and creating policy autonomy to choose our own path of development. And so the concentration of capital, the concentration of power, and securitization undermines any future prospect of a feminist economy, of women's liberation, of youth liberation, because the economic decision-making no longer happens in the corridors of state power. I think Samir Amin was right that what we're seeing now is global governance is dominated by monopolies and oligopolies, that the CEOs of big pharmaceuticals, big tech companies, and big banks actually give instructions to governments and to policymakers, both in the global north and in the south. And the idea, therefore, of science that serves capital as opposed to science and intellectual property rights that serve development, has become a key issue. So it's important for African young people, when they're looking at instruments and tools and means of domination, and therefore means of struggle and revolution, that yes, Mpiwa, the nation state seems to matter, but it only mattered insofar as it controlled movement of people. But when it came to determining the distribution of therapeutics, of vaccines, that business was not nation state driven. In fact, they were helpless, waiting for salvation from somewhere. And that is why it is billionaires who were the first responders, giving almost as a gift PPE to governments that have the wherewithal to invest in the production of PPE. Isn't this a joke? That we elect people who claim their nations are sovereign and cannot produce masks and hand sanitizer to keep our people safe, or invest in the young people that are doing this. So it seems to me, when you are discussing what you want discussed, Irene, in fighting pretentious Pan-Africanism, the first place of fight is its mortgage to transnational corporations and multinational corporations who produce goods and services and financial services as well. And then it is aligning the struggles of civil society with those of domestic, small to medium scale producers. I think we need a class alliance of the collectively affected forces, whether they're in agriculture, mining, telecoms, and so on and so forth, because otherwise we leave them to serve as subcontractors of these big entities. And the little trinkets they get make them feel exceptional. So that the tentacles of big business that is not accountable within our national constitutional confines or even continental frameworks of control, this covert and overt influence on political power, on electoral processes, this degradation and financialization of our democracies. It also means that the local governing class, whilst we must fight with that class to make sure that its consciousness is correct, our real problem is we fight them to avoid being recolonized, right? And to avoid them negotiating subordination based on their narrow interests. But they are vulnerable to political and social struggle. So the legitimacy of the state and the state elite can only be challenged by people who are combined. And I want to caution, outrage is not revolution or transformation. So it is possible to be outraged, to have a moment such as we had in Tunisia, such as we had in Sudan, unless young people and women are prepared, post the abdication of dictators, to fill the vacuum of power, of ideas that will have been created. What you will do is you will make the plank easier for entrepreneurial power merchants within the establishment. That's what we have seen across the continent. So that the death of young people in struggle on the streets, the blood shed that we have seen, has not resulted in transformation. So it requires a much more long-term thinking, long-term organizing.
I want to pick up on what you said about the space of long-term thinking, long-term organizing. And I'm really glad that we're talking about young people. I want us to even go to the next generation, because when we think about the now, we also have to think about 50 years from now. Who is this legacy? Who is this Africa? Who are we bequeathing it to? So I really like the question that Habil Ondiek has put on the table. Is it possible to liberate African education from, again, the Western superiority complex? Books we use, especially in higher learning institutions, are Western published. Most African intellectuals acquire their education abroad. I think the African education system, as is, contributes to colonialism. So his question is, how can education be reinvented to promote Pan-Africanism? If you could take those two together, and not just, I really would like us to think not only about higher learning institutions, but how do we transform even what knowledge is, all the way down from the lowest levels of our schooling systems, all the way up through the entire education system?
Well, you know, this is, I have a friend called Chika Yazyanya, who's done quite a lot of work on indigenous knowledge. And I've been asking Dr. Chika, I've said to her, what is indigenous knowledge? What is its value? And why do you insist on it? And she said two things to me that I think I want to start with. Number one, she said, all civilizations are constructed on the idea of their truths. And those truths are not necessarily universal, on the idea of their science. And that science, and no science is necessarily universal. Once you accept that science is universal, it depends on who dominates your construction of universal. So she said the first thing you need to do, and she gives very practical examples, so it's not just rhetoric, about how, if you like, a snail, the slime from the snail had been used in West Africa for a long time to cure a particular dangerous disease. And West Africans who go to study medicine never referred to it, never tried it, until researchers from Harvard, maybe 3-4 years ago, after hearing this, went and researched and then realized it actually is the most effective global cure. And yet this is a cure discovered many, many centuries ago by medicine people in West Africa. But the idea that what our people do is not science is what drove us not to even explore this. Think about storytelling. The way we tell our stories, I often refuse when I go to Western conferences and they say, you have to be brief. People don't like long stories. I said, no, you must come to my village. We don't tell stories short and we don't tell them direct. Partly it's because it is not the punchline that people are looking for. The journey to a story end is what makes us who we are. And I'm not going to change because you are a punchline civilization, because I'm not going to trade the ability to, to walk the journey with the lessons it does. So decolonization of education will remain incomplete unless we decolonize law, we decolonize engineering, we decolonize mathematics, we decolonize the entire gamut of things we call knowledge. So if you live in South Africa, the law is called Roman Dutch common law. Most people, Mshai, believe that the Romans and the Dutch actually are first cousins or they live in the same village. They don't realize that those are totally two different civilizations. So the law that people study in South Africa has English, Germanic, Roman, and Dutch components. Nobody has a problem with a universality that's constructed from taking 4 different European civilizations to get a notion of what is law. When it comes to Africa, difference is made premier. In fact, I always say that both the external scholar who looks into Africa engages in what I call the Premier League of pettiness. You know, they will tell you it can't be done because things are so different, people are so divided. And I asked them, before your ancestors got here, how did our people trade? Think about it. How did we construct a whole language called Swahili? Your language experts were not here, right? You know, your Department of Language was not here. Our people were able to do it. There are languages that are less than 200 years old that emerged as our people interacted. The ability to make history, the ability to make science is something that we are able to, capable of. And so for us to deal with decolonization, we need to deal with not just the curriculum. We need to deal with those who teach. But we need to deal with the structure and form of institutions that teach. Maybe, Mshai, we've been saved by virtual working, because you don't need to go into an imposing colonial structure whose architecture reminds you that those who design the architecture are superior. So when you are learning architecture, you have to learn Dutch architecture. When we sit here on a virtual platform, and I'm praying for the day that most of them will be owned by Africans so that we're not just consumers of the virtual platforms, making some young American or British person rich as we use this, right? On this virtual platform, we can tell our stories as did our ancestors. We can share our knowledge. And I'm not waiting for it to be validated in a physical context where my inferiority is reinforced just by how the architecture appears and the form of learning and of teaching. So I think the virtual platform presents an opportunity for decolonization. It is the content of decoloniality that I think that we need to construct and do so deliberately.
You know, it's interesting. I was just looking as you were speaking, and Mpo Letima asked, how can culture and creativity be used to leverage Africanism? And I'm really glad that you have almost answered that question. I'll ask you if you wanted to add something to that in answer to Mpo, to say that, as I bring you the last two questions. George Mukundi would like to know, how did Pan-Africanism yield to African Renaissance as advanced by Thabo Mbeki et al.? Could it have been a tacit concession that Pan-Africanism as an ideology and way of life is just but a dream? And perhaps could you share specific manifestations of contemporary Pan-Africanism? And Siad Olad, much on the same vein, asks, how is it we the youth have a struggle which is different from colonialism? Please, can you address how the upcoming youth should face their struggle and give us some advice as you do that?
Let me start with Siad. Siad, your struggle is not different. And I pray to God you realize this. Colonialism, simply defined, was the idea that an external actor, corporate or state, could come into your sphere, territory, and seek to control your culture, your land, your destiny, right? Today, your generation faces the recolonization of Africa through takeover, not just of your knowledge platforms by control by external entities, but taking over your natural resources. Your roads are not being built by your own people. Your buildings are not being built by your own people. Your own people are unemployed. And so as they click away on Facebook and take selfies, they do not realize that here is a colonial enterprise rolling out, taking over the continent, not just the present, but the future. And lying to us that the struggle that our ancestors fought was different. The colonialist before came with a Maxim gun. Today he comes with a debt that we don't need, like happened in Mozambique, giving a country debt that it does not need so that its sovereignty is auctioned. Today they come with infrastructure that we don't need so that our countries are totally paying for infrastructure that doesn't necessarily benefit our people on a daily basis. You are faced with the worst form of colonial moment than I was, than my parents were. Your struggle is not different. Your consciousness of the extent of the danger you face may be what is different. And I would urge you as a young person, be conscious of the geopolitics and the geoeconomics. When my ancestors resisted colonial occupation, there were no colonial military bases on this continent. Today, almost every country that thinks it has power has a military base. It has control over our airspace. In Niger, they can send drones to execute without trial people that they suspect to be terrorists in Somalia. So that means our countries have no sovereignty or very little sovereignty left. And your generation will have a lot less because you don't control information. You don't control security, whether it's cyber security, physical security, or human security. So I would urge you, the desire for exceptionalism and difference is admirable. The forces, global and otherwise, are using the same method of colonial occupation. In my country, Zimbabwe, it was a British entrepreneur called Cecil John Rhodes, and in South Africa. He came under the guise of establishing a company, and he ended up buying 3 countries and naming them after himself. I think your generation faces worse. Zambia is unable to pay debt. It's likely to be taken over. All these countries that are getting into debt, whose ports are likely to be taken over, whose airports are likely to be taken over, whose factories. If this is not colonialism, I don't know what is. If you are not fighting this struggle, I don't know what you are fighting. And I'd like to turn to my brother, George Nkundi. George, I was at the African Renaissance Conference. I don't think that it took over Pan-Africanism. There are limits in articulation of a renaissance Africa, because it starts off on the history of greatness that says Africa was great before. We need to recreate, number one. Number two, the Mbeki idea, which led to NEPAD and the formation of the AU, was the idea that Africa could offer solutions to the globe. So they were suggesting with Obasanjo and Abdoulaye Wade, the integration of Africa into the global economy. And those of us who criticized this indicated that the missing link in their approach was the state-centric approach of integration of Africa as a supplier of goods and services driven by capital and states, but in the absence of the idea of African citizenship, made this necessarily anti-Pan-African. That the idea of a robust and holistic Pan-Africanism requires first and foremost Pan-Africanism from below, that you grow the vibrancy of Africans, the citizenship of Africans, so that they are able to freely move across the continent, the right of residence and the right of establishment. So that what you are doing is not just creating a big global market that enables global capital and African multinational corporations to trade with each other without creating value for ordinary Africans. And I don't think that we necessarily need to see the two ideas as mutually exclusive. Does Africa need to look back in order to look forward? Yes. Those of us who are Pan-Africanists insist. The tragedy of our continent is that we have run many things based on memory, remembering how great and awesome we were in days gone by. But we have not had the courage to use our imagination by harvesting the innovativeness amongst African young people, by enabling these African young people access not just to the state and to market, but to voice, to place, to be shapers of policy. So it would appear to me that, George, if you are looking at practical Pan-Africanism, let's start with what states have done. They were trading, rushing to see which one can trade flowers with the Netherlands, beef with Europe. And then they realized that after trading flowers and beef and this political beauty pageant that they were engaged in, and the race to the bottom on who could lower standards to attract investment, that they are all in the midst of a pandemic non-viable. And that the political elite incessantly, from Egypt to Burkina Faso to Zimbabwe to Sudan, is faced with existential questions. The failure to provide for the socio-economic welfare and well-being of citizens leads to insurrection. And that therefore it is not possible to construct a trade regime that counts how many things you've sent outside when your people are not fed, when your people are not clothed, when they are not housed. So the Continental Free Trade Area, the AFCFTA, is one such attempt. The idea of an Africa standby force to intervene when there are conflicts in Africa is one such expression of Pan-Africanism. The idea, the very idea that we're now saying they are special envoys for youth, for women, for peace and security, is a slow realization that you can no longer deal with issues of the majority of the population as a ghetto, that you can no longer make policies purely to increase and develop infrastructure, mega infrastructure. As the Canadian poet Edward Markham said, why do we build the cities glorious when the builder in building remains unbuilt? The urgent business of current Pan-Africanism is to rebuild the African. Make sure that our young people are skilled and not just educated or literate. Make sure that we build micro economies so that our producers are able to store and preserve their goods and then build value chains that enable them to take these goods to you. But enable our people to move, to share their skills, enable an integration through integration of our culture, right? A lot of people are persuaded Pan-Africanism is dead. I keep telling them, Shai, I don't know why Africans believe in lies. I'd rather respect an African that believes in witchcraft. Let me give you a sense of Shai. If I say capitalism has failed, many people will come up against me. But do you realize that In 1928, there's something called the Great Depression, where capitalism totally collapsed and resulted in the loss of life and loss of businesses. 1974, the Great Debt Crisis. 1984, the global debt crisis. 2008, the global financial crisis. Should I go on? Right. Coronavirus, and we're seeing capital needing the state to bail it out. Nobody ever says capitalism failed, but let them talk about Pan-Africanism. Ask them, why do you say Pan-Africanism failed? Or look at how we are divided. There is a war in Central African Republic. If episodic failure was a definition of eternal failure, capitalism failed a long time ago. Mm-hmm. Democracy in America. People say, oh, African democracy has failed. And I ask them why. Oh, it's because it's ethnic. I say, all democracy has been xenophobic and ethnic. The same people that wrote the American Constitution and said all men are created equal, they owned slaves. They believed Negroes or Black people were property. They refused to give women the right to vote until 1930. And for those of you who are not students of history, America was not liberated in 1929. No. It was over 100. They could justify to themselves xenophobically why women could not vote until 1930. Or they were not willing to concede civil rights for Black people simply on the basis of the color of their skin until the 1960s. Today, Black people in America still say we can't breathe. Why? The same system we call a democracy, around which we want to model our own democracies, is xenophobic against the lower classes, xenophobic against Afro-descendants. I dare not go to Europe. The whole city development processes. I dare not talk about global drug law enforcement that is racialized. No, I dare not talk about how women, African women, are treated in Europe and migrants are treated. So nobody ever says European democracy has failed because it has treated other people in a bad way. So the challenge, George, is not to pepper over the failures of the elites that run our politics, or even the limitations of African civil society and intellectuals. It is to ask ourselves a hard-nosed question, which is this. Every global idea was once a local idea. Mshai, idealism drives innovation. When I was growing up, there was a guy called Knight Rider who used to speak to his watch and call his car called Kit, which was a driverless car, right? Today, that idealism is real. They're driverless cars. Why? The imagination of young men and women in the West was spared by the idealism of Knight Rider and Kit. Until we become idealistic about the possibilities of Africa, Afro-realism does not mean sitting where we are sitting, where the sewage does not run, or the refuse is not collected, or there are flying toilets, and say that is our fate. It is to say another Africa is possible. That Nkrumah was not the be-all and end-all of Pan-Africanism. We're grateful for the ideas he planted. When they killed him, they thought they were burying him. But Nkrumah was a seed that has grown in Afro texts, grown in African artists, grown in African academics. It is our business to refine the thoughts of Nkrumah facing forward. It is not to look backward at the limitations of Nkrumah's generation. Nkrumah did not have a PhD from the same institutions you all have PhDs from. Nkrumah did not have internet that gives him information every minute. Nkrumah knew a lot less than you do. He was not on Instagram or Facebook. He was able to mobilize a continent. What can you do now that you are privileged with tools that enable you to communicate in real time? It is laziness to look back and say they failed. What will your generation and my generation say we achieved? Pessimism? An acceptance of Euro-American superiority? An acceptance that those who are running our states will always rule us? Surely there's a revolutionary favor and flavor in each one of us that says we deserve better, we deserve different. And we will fight for that ideal, even if it is only in our heads. And that is Pan-Africanism. The refusal to give in and to die. Our ancestors survived slavery. They are still here. survived colonialism, they are still here. Survived military dictatorship, they are still here. Survived kleptomaniacs, they are still here. You are still here. So let's fight.
Wow, what a great, great way to put a pause, not an end to the conversation. Brian, I can't thank you enough. I want to hold you to your promise, and I'm going to do that by announcing publicly that Brian will join the rest of the panel next week, just to continue this conversation. And what we're going to be doing next week is really going back and re-engaging with some of the things that Brian has said. And then we hope to have a much more vibrant conversation in terms of being able to have many more of you share your comments, give us some more questions to think through, perhaps push back and look more closely at the nuances and contradictions of some of what we have begun to explore today. Brian, I want to share with you and everybody else some of the comments that have come through. Maybe I'll just pick three. And interestingly, all these three say much more or less the same thing. Lucy Wakiaga says, this has been a wonderful discussion. Her comment is that our crumbling socio-economic and political structures have slowly led to citizen apathy, and has said that we should find effective and practical ways of cascading conversations like the one today to the grassroots and reawaken love of self and of community. Wairimo Nderito has asked if we could kindly share a transcript of this presentation so that we can, disseminate it to a wider audience, please. And David Mwambari has noted that all these discussions are good for intellectuals mostly, and especially Anglophones, but we know that the majority of those suffering are not online or on webinars, and we need money to make this work. David, I love this. This is a challenge, not to Brian, not to our hosts, but to all of us. Which investors can step forward and invest in making some of these ideas a reality for the majority who need this knowledge? And so I'm going to start from there. I'm going to invite you to please share widely. To answer Wairimo's question, this conversation is going to be on it is being live streamed right now through the Alliance Française de Nairobi's YouTube account. And after that, it will remain up there, so you can continue to share it. The Elephant is going to also put this on its platform. And Brian has shared with us some recommended readings for those of you who want to go much more into some of the history. I think we have the resolutions from the Pan-African conferences and some of these critical documents that have influenced a lot of the thinking and discourse in Pan-Africanism. And you can find that at www.theelephant.info. Give us a couple of days to put up all of that so that we can also harvest some more of some of what Brian has given us. I think he gave us a number of other books and recommended readings even as he proceeded through. For those of you who are registered, we will send you an invitation to next week's conversation. And what we'll do is we'll also add the list of recommended readings on that. So please make sure that you register. And I think those of you who are in the webinar, we are sharing some of those readings right now in the chat so that you can harvest them directly. I'm going to say, in the words that Solomon has given us, Asante Sana Brian, this has been such a rich, robust, challenging, and penetrating presentation. So you can imagine how excited I am that next week at exactly this particular time, 7:30 EAT, 6:30 CAT, 5:30, I believe that would be West African time, and 4:30 UTC, we will have Godwin Murunga, Dr. Godwin Murunga, who is an academic and a student of history, and Zukiswa Wana, who is a publisher and writer, who will help us in conversation with Brian, expand this conversation. So yes, Mpo will come back and look at the place of culture and creativity. I just want to say again, thank you very, very much, each person who has joined in the conversation. For those of you who are still putting in questions in the chat and the Q&A, we will pick up, I'll harvest those chats and I'll bring them to next week's conversation. So from all of us, from the Elephant, from IFRA Nairobi, from Alliance de Française de Nairobi, thank you very, very much. Once again, Brian, we look forward to having you join us. And we really, really, really appreciate the time that you have taken, the thinking that you have put into this presentation, and for just giving us so much of your valuable time, especially when you are just arriving. I know you had a rather heavy assignment that you've been carrying out on behalf of the continent and those of us who believe in the ideals that you have articulated of Pan-Africanism. Thank you, thank you, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
I don't know me,